My wealthy ex-husband, and his new arrogant wife publicly attempt to humiliate me at an elite charity auction by trying to buy out my family's historic estate. They don't realize my decades of experience as a high-end art appraiser and forensic auction auditor mean I know the exact secret origin and massive tax liability of the prized masterpiece they are using to fund their entire bid. My name is Eleanor Vance. I'm 58 years old, and for 32 years I worked as a senior art appraiser and forensic document auditor for museum acquisitions across the East Coast. What my ex-husband Richard and his new 29-year-old wife Chloe didn't know as they stood on the glittering stage of the Grand Harbor charity auction was that the 2 sentences I was about to whisper to the auctioneer's assistant would completely halt the bidding, and what his own Black American Express card was about to tell the entire room 15 minutes later would leave him bankrupt in front of 400 of the city's elite. They thought they were buying my family's 200-year-old coastal estate for pennies on the dollar to tear it down for a resort. They thought I was just a bitter, quiet ex-wife sitting at table 14 in an off-the-rack navy dress. They were dead wrong. Welcome back to her final chapter, where every story starts with silence and ends with power. If you've ever been written off, underestimated, or treated like background noise by the people who were supposed to cherish you, this one's for you. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and let's get into it. For over 3 decades, my eyes were my currency. As a certified forensic appraiser, I spent my career beneath halogen lamps, using ultraviolet light, raking illumination, and chemical tests to spot the microscopic flaws in oil paintings and rare manuscripts. I could look at a canvas and tell you not just who painted it, but the humidity level of the room where the frame was constructed in 1840. I knew how to follow paper trails through Swiss bank vaults and probate courts. It was painstaking, precise work that required absolute emotional detachment. You cannot let a painting's beauty blind you to its forgery. Outside of my work, I had one small foolish habit. I collected vintage silver fountain pens from the 1920s. I kept a Mont Blanc Meisterstück from 1924 in my purse at all times, filled with waterproof midnight blue ink. I liked the weight of it in my hand. I liked that in a world of quick digital signatures and forgotten promises, a fountain pen required intention. You had to press down. You had to leave a permanent mark. When Richard and I divorced 3 years ago after 28 years of marriage, I didn't fight him for his real estate development firm, his yachts, or his penthouses. I asked for only one thing: Oak Ridge Manor, the historic oceanfront home in Maine that had been in my family for 4 generations. It was where my father taught me how to examine brushstrokes, where my late mother's rose garden still bloomed every June. Richard didn't care about the house then. He took the liquid assets, the investment portfolios, and the social status. I took my childhood home, quietness, and my antique pens, or so I thought. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in late October. It wasn't sent via regular mail. It was hand-delivered by a process server while I was pruning the hydrangeas in the front yard. Attached to a thick stack of legal documents was a brief, handwritten note on heavy cream cardstock. The handwriting belonged to Chloe, Richard's former executive assistant turned second wife. The note read, "Time to wake up, Eleanor. We're taking the estate. You don't belong here anymore." I stood on the porch, the cold wind blowing off the bay, and read the legal filing. Richard's firm had quietly purchased a predatory balloon mortgage attached to the estate's land trust, a obscure financial lien my late brother had taken out 15 years ago that I didn't even know existed. They were calling the full balance due, $1.2 million, payable in 30 days. If I couldn't pay, the property would go to a private for-sale auction managed by the Regional Historical Board, a board where Richard had recently been appointed chairman. When I called Richard to ask why he was doing this to a home that held no value to his commercial developments, he didn't scream or sound angry. He spoke with that smooth, condescending tone he always used when he thought I was being hysterical. "It's just business, Eleanor," he said softly through the speakerphone. "Chloe wants a summer venue, and frankly, you don't belong here anymore." To understand how a man could try to strip his wife of 28 years of her ancestral home, you have to understand how our marriage ended. In October 2023, Richard suffered a mild heart attack. I spent 3 weeks sleeping on a vinyl chair in the ICU, managing his medications, handling his company's crisis communications, and keeping his panicked investors calm. On the day he was discharged, I went to his office to pick up his personal laptop so he could work from home during recovery. While searching for his medical insurance files, I found a folder labeled Project Sapphire. Inside were 3 years of hotel receipts, luxury jewelry invoices totaling $140,000, and wire transfers to a private bank account in Chloe's name. He hadn't just cheated, he had been funding her lavish lifestyle using capital drawn directly from our joint retirement trust. When I confronted him, he didn't apologize. He looked at me with cold detachment and said, "You've grown boring, Eleanor. You care about old paper and dust. I care about building an empire." The divorce was swift. I was emotionally drained, grieving the sudden loss of the man I thought I knew. My lawyer begged me to go after his development firm, to audit his business accounts, but I was too exhausted to fight. I signed the settlement, taking Oak Ridge Manor and a modest pension, leaving him with over $18 million in assets. I wanted peace. I thought paying a price in dollars was worth buying my freedom. If I'm being completely honest with myself, and honesty is the only thing I have left, I let him off easy, not just out of exhaustion, but out of a desperate, pathetic hope. A part of me hoped that by being the graceful ex-wife, by not dragging his name through the mud in the local papers, he would eventually feel a pang of guilt. I hoped that somewhere deep down, he would remember the years we spent sitting on the porch at Oak Ridge, drinking black coffee and watching the tide come in. I wanted him to respect me, even if he didn't love me anymore. That was my mistake. I mistook his lack of shame for mercy. The night after I received the auction notice, my best friend Sarah, a sharp, straight-shooting probate attorney, sat at my kitchen table, pouring 2 glasses of dry red wine. "Eleanor, listen to me," Sarah said, leaning across the table, her knuckles white against her glass. "You cannot fight Richard on his home turf. He owns the historical board. He has 4 high-priced corporate lawyers on retainer. If you try to challenge this mortgage in court, he will bleed you dry in legal fees before you even get a court date. Cut your losses. Pack up your antiques, let them have the house, and buy a nice condo in the city." "It's my family's home, Sarah," I whispered, holding my cold hands around the wine glass. "It's wood and brick, Eleanor," she snapped, her voice softening with pity. "Don't let that arrogant bastard take your peace twice. He wants you to crawl. He wants you to spend your last savings fighting him in public so he can watch you fail. Walk away." Her words hung in the quiet kitchen. She was right, logically. Going to that public auction meant walking into a trap designed specifically to humiliate me. It meant standing in a room full of people who used to come to my dinner parties, watching them whisper as my life was auctioned off. I took a deep breath, reached into my purse, and felt the heavy, cold silver of my 1924 Montblanc pen. "I'm not walking away, Sarah," I said softly, "and I'm not going to crawl." The auction was set for Saturday evening at the Grand Harbor Yacht Club. The premise was a high society charity gala. The proceeds from the historical board's private property sales would go toward local maritime preservation, while the main event of the night was a high-stakes art auction. When I arrived at 7:00 p.m., the ballroom was a sea of black tuxedos and silk gowns. Valets were parking Bentleys and Ferraris. I walked through the heavy mahogany doors alone, wearing a simple navy wool dress and low heels. I checked the event program. Richard hadn't just arranged to auction my home. He had framed the entire event as a personal triumph. Page 3 of the glossy booklet featured a full-page photo of Richard and Chloe, titled, "Preserving History: How the Vance Development Group is Restoring Coastal Heritage." The first gap between expectation and reality hit me immediately. The legal notice had claimed my house was being auctioned to settle a private lien of $1.2 million. But as I scanned the auction catalog's fine print, I realized Richard had set the opening bid for Oak Ridge Manor at $3 million and had listed his own firm as the primary secured creditor entitled to collect any surplus funds beyond the debt. He wasn't just taking my home. He was planning to make a $1.8 million tax-free profit on the sale in front of all our old friends. I moved quietly toward the silent auction tables near the bar, keeping my head down. "Is that Eleanor?" a voice whispered to my left. It was Evelyn Sterling, a woman whose foundation I had done appraisal work for 5 years ago. She was standing with 2 other society wives. "I heard Richard is buying her family place tonight to build Chloe's new spa retreat," Poor thing, sitting all by herself. She looks so washed up. That was the first brick. I walked toward the back alcove, where the featured art pieces for the live auction were displayed. Standing in front of the center easel was Chloe, draped in an emerald silk gown that must have cost $15,000, holding a glass of vintage champagne. Beside her stood Richard, looking flushed and triumphant in a tailored Brioni tuxedo. On the easel behind them hung the crown jewel of the evening's art auction, an unsigned late 19th century maritime oil painting attributed to the American master Winslow Homer, titled The Storm Approach. According to the catalog, the painting had been donated by Richard and Chloe from their private collection, with an estimated value of $4.5 million. The pro-single painting were supposed to secure Richard's position as the lifetime chairman of the Historical Cultural Fund. As I approached the painting, Chloe turned and saw me. She didn't flinch. She smiled, stepping forward so her diamond necklace caught the light. "Eleanor, you actually came," Chloe declared, her voice carrying across the quiet gallery space. "We were worried you'd be too embarrassed." "Don't worry," Richard promised. "He'll let you come pick up your old family photo albums before the demolition crew starts in December." That was the second brick. Richard didn't look me in the eye. He took a slow sip of his scotch, adjusted his gold cufflinks, and murmured, "Let it go, Eleanor. It's just business. You know how these things work. Stay with me, because what happened next, I planned in the time it takes to dry your hands." I didn't answer them. I stepped closer to the painting, pulling a small jeweler's loop, a habit of 30 years, from my purse. I didn't touch the canvas. I simply leaned in under the warm gallery lights and examined the bottom right quadrant near the gilt frame. What I saw made my blood run cold, then instantly boil with absolute icy clarity. The painting was indeed an authentic late 19th century work, but it wasn't a Winslow Homer. It was a study by his contemporary, Charles Berryman, a fine artist, but one whose works rarely fetched more than $150,000 at auction. Worse, beneath the fresh coat of varnish applied near the signature area, I caught the distinct, microscopic crazing of a forced synthetic glaze, a telltale sign that someone had recently altered the provenance documentation to forge a Homer attribution. I knew Richard's art buyer, a slippery gallery owner named Marcus Vance, no relation, who had been raided by the FBI 5 years ago for tax fraud involving inflated charitable donations. I stepped back, my mind racing through public land records and tax registries I had memorized over decades. To claim a $4.5 million tax deduction for donating an art piece, Richard would have had to file a sworn IRS Schedule 83 appraisal form. If the painting was a forged attribution worth only $150,000, Richard hadn't just brought a fake to a charity auction. He had committed federal wire fraud and tax evasion, exceeding $1 million. I slipped my loop back into my purse and turned around. A waiter passed by carrying a tray of champagne. Standing near the pillar behind Richard was Marcus Vance, the art dealer himself, nervously sweating through his collar and checking his phone every 30 seconds. Overheard him whispering into his receiver, "The IRS audit clearance hasn't come through yet, Richard. If someone looks at the back of the stretchers before the gavel drops, we're done." And thundered against my ribs, but my hands remained entirely still. Everything recontextualized in an instant. Richard didn't have $18 million in liquid cash anymore. His development projects in the city had stalled during the high interest rate hikes. He was over-leveraged. He was using this charity auction and the massive fraudulent tax write-off from the fake Homer to shore up his firm's failing balance sheet and pay for his acquisition of my estate. He wasn't an invincible tycoon buying my home out of strength. He was a desperate fraudster hanging on by a single thread of stolen silk. I walked toward the main dining hall as the chimes sounded for dinner. As I passed table 2, where Richard's major financial investors were seated, Chloe called out across the room, her voice echoing off the crystal chandeliers. "Make sure you stick around for the real estate bidding, Eleanor. We'd hate for you to miss the moment your past gets wiped clean. After all, you don't belong here anymore." The entire table burst into light, cruel laughter. That was the third brick, and it was the last one they would ever throw at me. At 9 p.m., the main auction began. The auctioneer, a distinguished man named Julian Thorne, stood at the mahogany podium, his microphone echoing through the packed ballroom. The room was dark, save for the bright spotlights illuminating the stage where Oak Ridge Manor's architectural blueprints and photos were displayed on massive screen monitors. "Item 14, Julian Thorne announced, his voice booming. "The historic coastal property known as Oak Ridge Manor. Opening bid requested at $3 million. Richard stood up immediately from table 1, raising his paddle high above his head. "$3 million, Richard called out, his voice loud, confident, reverberating through the hall. Silence fell over the room. No one else bid. Everyone in high society knew Richard wanted the land. No one was willing to enter a bidding war against a man they believed had endless capital. "I have $3 million from Mr. Richard Vance," Thorne called out, looking around the room. "Going once, going twice." From the back row, at table 14, I stood up. I didn't raise a paddle. I simply raised my right hand, holding my vintage silver Mont Blanc pen between my fingers. "I object to the sale," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but 30 years of lecturing in museum halls gave it a clear, carrying timbre that sliced through the room. The audience turned in their seats. Necks craned. Whispers broke out like dry leaves catching fire. Richard turned around, his face twisting into a mixture of annoyance and disgust. He stepped out from behind his table, walking halfway down the center aisle, glaring at me under the spotlights. "Eleanor, sit down," Richard said loudly, making sure the entire room heard him. "You don't have the funds to satisfy the mortgage lien. You don't have a legal standing here tonight. And frankly, you don't belong here anymore." He delivered the phrase clearly, smiling slightly as he looked at the wealthy investors watching from their tables. Chloe clapped her hands softly in approval from her seat. I let the silence sit. 1 second. 2 seconds, 3 seconds, 4 seconds. 5 full seconds stretched across the room until the rustling of silk dresses ceased entirely. The air in the ballroom felt thick enough to choke on. I didn't flush. I didn't lower my eyes. I looked directly into the face of the man I had spent 28 years of my life with, and I felt nothing at all. "The sale of Oak Ridge Manor," I said calmly, stepping out into the center aisle, "is conditional upon the secured creditor's financial standing and the validity of the collateral submitted to this board to guarantee the auction bond. Isn't that correct, Mr. Thorne?" The auctioneer, Julian Thorne, blinked, visibly flustered. "Mrs. Vance, this is an auction, not a court of law. Mr. Vance has provided a corporate bond backed by his recent $4.5 million art donation to the Historical Fund." "He has," I said, taking 3 slow steps forward down the carpeted aisle. He offered the storm approach, attributed to Winslow Homer, as the valuation collateral for his line of credit to secure tonight's land purchase. Richard chuckled loudly, shaking his head for the benefit of the crowd. "She's lost her mind. Julian, call security. She's trying to disrupt a charitable event because she's bitter about her divorce." 2 security guards in black suits began moving toward me from the side doors. I didn't look at them. I reached into my leather folio and pulled out 3 sheets of paper. Copies I had printed from the National Art Authenticity Registry in the manager's office 20 minutes prior, using my professional credentials. "Julian," I called out, my voice entirely steady. "Before security touches me, I suggest you ask your chief appraiser to turn the storm approach around and examine the stretcher bars under a 365 nanometer ultraviolet lamp. Specifically, look for the inventory stamp of the Berryman estate, dated 1912, hidden beneath the fresh pine lining." The auctioneer paused. He looked toward the side of the stage where the head of the Maritime Museum's Conservation Department, Dr. R.S. Thorne, no relation to the auctioneer, was standing. Was a respected scholar who knew me well from my years at the museum. Dr. Thorne didn't wait. He stepped over to the easel, pulled a pocket UV torch from his jacket, and shined it directly onto the back of the canvas. The entire room went dead silent. You could hear the hum of the air conditioning unit overhead. Richard took a step toward the stage, his face suddenly losing all its color. "This is ridiculous! That painting was authenticated by Marcus Vance Fine Arts." On stage, Dr. Thorne gasped slightly. He pulled out a magnifying glass, pressed it to the corner of the canvas, and then immediately looked up at Julian Thorne with a wide-eyed, terrified expression. "Stop the bidding," Dr. Thorne said into his lapel microphone. His voice echoed across the room. "The attribution is false. The signature is a modern acrylic addition over an organic varnish. This is not a Homer. It's an altered Berryman. Market value is under $100,000. A collective gasp ripped through the ballroom. People actually stood up on their chairs to see. Chloe's jaw dropped. She looked at Richard, her voice rising to a sharp screech. "Richard, what is he talking about? You said that painting was our tax shelter for the entire quarter." "Shut up, Chloe," Richard barked, his composure completely shattering. He lunged toward the auctioneer's podium. "It's a mistake, a technical error by the gallery. I have the liquid funds to cover the auction bond regardless. I'll pay cash for Oak Ridge Manor right now." Richard pulled out his black American Express Centurion card, the ultimate symbol of his unshakable wealth, and slammed it down onto the auctioneer's wooden desk. "Swipe it," Richard shouted, his face turning dark purple, veins bulging at his temples. "Charge the $300,000 auction deposit right now. I own the mortgage, and I own that house." Julian Thorne, trembling slightly, took the black metal card and swiped it through the mobile terminal connected to the board's bank account. Beep. A sharp, high-pitched error tone rang out through the venue's sound system. The terminal screen flashed red. "Declined. Code 51. Insufficient funds." Richard stared at the machine. "That's impossible. Try it again. Try it again right now." Julian swiped the card a second time. Beep. Declined. Account frozen by lien. "No! No!" Richard yelled, slamming his fist onto the podium so hard his glass of water tumbled over, soaking his Brioni jacket. "Use the secondary line. The commercial credit line." He yanked a platinum corporate card from his wallet with trembling fingers and forced it into the card reader. Beep. Declined. Invalid authorization. The 400 wealthy attendees in the room, the very people Richard had spent 3 years trying to impress, the investors whose money he needed to keep his firm afloat, were now staring at him in utter horror and disgust. Whispers erupted into open laughter at the front tables. Richard stood on the stage, soaked in water, his hair disheveled, holding 3 useless pieces of plastic in his hand, breathing heavily like a cornered animal. He looked down the aisle at me. His eyes were wide, filled with a terrifying mixture of panic, rage, and sudden, desperate realization. "Eleanor," he stammered, his voice dropping into a raspy, cracking plea. "Eleanor, please, talk to them. You know the board members. Tell them we can sort this out privately. You know me. I'm your husband." I walked slowly down the aisle until I stood right at the base of the stage, looking up at him. I pulled my vintage Montblanc pen from my pocket, unscrewed the cap, and held it up slightly. "I don't owe you, Richard," I said, my voice quiet, clear, and utterly cold. "I never did. The fallout was swift, total, and merciless, because the auction was a public event covered by local press. News of the forged Homer painting and the card rejections reached the state attorney general's office by Monday morning. An emergency audit was ordered into Richard's development firm. Within 3 weeks, investigators uncovered millions in fraudulent tax filings and misallocated investor funds. Richard's firm filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy before Christmas. His assets were frozen, his commercial licenses were revoked, and he currently faces federal grand jury indictments for wire fraud and tax evasion. Chloe filed for divorce 6 weeks after the gala, taking what little remained of her prenuptial allowance and moving to Miami. Because Richard's firm failed to satisfy the legal conditions of the auction bond, the predatory mortgage lien on Oak Ridge Manor was declared void by the probate court due to fraudulent acquisition practices. The property returned to my family trust, free and clear of all debts forever. 2 months later, in late January, I was sitting in the library at Oak Ridge Manor. The ocean outside was gray and churning under a light snowfall, but inside the stone fireplace was crackling with warm pine logs. There was a soft knock at the front door. When I opened it, I didn't find Richard, or process servers, or news reporters. Standing on the porch was Marcus Vance, the nervous art dealer who had supplied Richard with the forged painting. He was wearing a worn coat, his shoulders hunched against the cold wind. He wasn't arrogant anymore, He looked like a broken man waiting for a sentence. He reached into his leather bag and pulled out a flat, heavy package wrapped in brown butcher paper and tied with twine. "Mrs. Vance?" Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper, his breath fogging in the freezing air. "I'm going to prison next month. I know that. But before I go, I wanted you to have this." I didn't open it immediately. "What is it, Marcus?" "When Richard hired me to appraise your family's estate 2 years ago," Marcus said, looking down at his boots, "he told me to clean out your late husband's study and throw away all his personal clutter. I found this at the bottom of a desk drawer. Richard told me to throw it in the incinerator. I couldn't do it. I knew what it meant to you." He handed me the package, bowed his head, and walked back down the icy driveway toward his beat-up sedan without asking for forgiveness or money. I stepped back inside, closed the heavy oak door, and sat down by the fire. With trembling hands, I untied the twine and folded back the brown paper. Inside was a pristine, unframed oil sketch on wood panel, a quiet, gorgeous sunset over the ocean, painted in soft blues and golden yellows. In the bottom left corner was a tiny, familiar inscription written in fine black ink. "For Eleanor, where the tide always brings you home. Thomas, 1995. It was a sketch my late husband had painted for me on our 10th anniversary, a piece I thought had been lost forever during our move years ago. Richard hadn't destroyed it. It had survived. I held the small wooden panel against my chest. For the first time in 3 years, I didn't feel anger, or betrayal, or the cold satisfaction of revenge. I sat in the quiet warmth of my home, listened to the waves crashing against the cliffs outside, and let the warm tears fall freely down my face. The house wasn't just saved. The memories inside it were finally safe. True power never screams, never boasts, and never needs an audience. It simply waits for the truth to clear the room. That's my story. If it meant something to you, drop a comment and tell me. I read every single one. And if you want more stories like this, hit subscribe to her final chapter, because there's another one waiting for you next week.